Hi, I'm Josh, and I am ready for winter to be over. As much as I enjoy trolling Canadians who complain about snow and cold as if there's no way they could have ever predicted that Canada would be snowy and cold in the winter, all I can say about 2025 is mer gerd, sir, merch, snur. It is absolutely ridiculous. In my part of southern Ontario, I have never seen this much snow in my entire life. It reminds me of the first winter I moved up to northern Ontario to start my paramedic career, and it's left me completely exhausted and aching with all the shoveling. I've been losing a few pounds over the past couple of weeks because every time I go out to shovel for an hour or two, I lose about 3 to 5 pounds in sweat, and I do manage to rehydrate and get a lot of it back, but my body is not keeping up with the amount of snow we've got. I'm shoveling snow into snowbanks that are in places over my head, and I'm 6 feet tall, and I'm literally running out of room to put snow. I'm not sure where to put it at this point if it snows anymore to the degree that it has been. But anyways, I'm going to be talking more about ice and snow and weather and climate in general as I talk about this book called Underland, A Deep Time Journey by Robert Macfarlane. Now, the first thing about Underland here is it's a very hard book to categorize. So it's a nonfiction book, for sure. It is part science, part history, part travel, part nature and ecology, part poetry, part adventure, and part appeal for caring for the earth. So it's a really difficult book to categorize. The author himself, in talking about this book and other books that he's written, says, "For more than 15 years now, I've been writing about the relationships between landscape and the human heart," which is a good way to describe the writing here. I also like Wikipedia's summary. Wikipedia says, "The book is a descriptive journey by the author of different subterranean landscapes that he explores. These underground spaces represent burial and unburial and deep time. Through these underground journeys, the book sheds light on the impacts and consequences of human actions within the Anthropocene geological epoch." So yeah, there's a lot of interesting stuff being explored in this book, obviously with a focus on what is happening below the surface of our world that we walk about on and live our daily lives. I'm going to, unlike most books where I do a very brief plot summary and then kind of go over various themes that the book discussed, I'm going to actually go through in chronological order. See, I'm so tired I can't even talk. I'm going to go through the book chapter by chapter, give just a 1 or 2 sentence summary of what the chapter was about, and in some cases pull out some quotes from the chapter that I found particularly interesting or inspiring. Now, I do have this video divided up into chapters, so skip all the parts you're not interested in, but please at least watch the end of the video where I really cover the most poignant points that came up in the book. So definitely please check that out. Otherwise, skip away the rest of the boring stuff. The first thing I'll talk about, though, is the writing. Now, I did mention that the book is part poetry, and the way that the author presents his journeys, his experiences, the things that he learned, is in a slightly interesting stylized way of writing. So here's an example of where I thought the writing was particularly nice to give you a feel for how it was written. So the author starts off this section early in the book by saying, "Over field and down into bower of elder and old ash, moss plushing rock to soft gold green, follow the stream bed through gorse and bracken, setting field fares flaring to the west with chatter and crackle, swallows skimming meadows on the fly, blowy warmth in a northeast wind, on and into the deep-set hollow, a last nod to the sun, to the light falling through leaves in nets, to to the buzzard drifting over, and then we are down a hole in the stone-cold soil, worn to a swallet by the run of a stream, into the earth's gullet, into the black bite of a polished stone vise set carelessly and wondrously with the spirals of amenities and the bullets of belemnites, and down into trouble. Now don't worry, the entire book isn't written like that. These are just the kind of descriptive passages in between the more, I guess, clear-cut science talk and conversations he has with various people that he meets along the way. I will say, though, that there are parts where this style does get a little bit grating. It has this very kind of staccato, start-stop rhythm to it, which, like I said, after a while can be slightly annoying, and here's an example of what I mean before I move on to talk about the book itself, which again, it is very interesting and sort of slightly beautiful and poetic writing. I'm not trying to knock it, it's just you read over 400 pages of it, and after a while, I don't know, here's what I'm trying to say. The author starts off a new chapter near the end of the book now with this: birches, birches, pines, birches, clearing, blue farmhouse, low river valley, wooden bridge, everything frozen, rivers, trees, turf, fields, pink crag of granite, yellow icefall spilling from it, boulders big as houses between the birches, among the pines, black crow pulling red flesh off the white ribs of a dead fox, jackdaw, jackdaw. This is not a place for you. The pirate radio station plays Blondie's Atomic. Snakes of spindrift race on the blacktop. Snow whirls in the headlights. Gray air that will not brighten. A boy riding a bike with sit-up-and-beg handlebars. His back very straight, fast past a blue letterbox on a white pole. Nice, silver gray, quick with mica and ice. This place is not a place of honor. Over the bridge to the island, salt marsh to either side of the bridge, sea in shattered slabs of ice, wind skittering stiff reeds, and starlings moving black above the reeds. The sea is frozen for half a mile offshore. Far out in the Gulf, beyond sight, there are 30-foot high waves moving west through the half-light. No highly esteemed deed is commemorated here. And on it goes in a similar manner. So I will say that it is a well-written book in a very interesting style, but it's the information within the book that interests me to a much greater extent than how it was written, and let's get into that now. So chapter 1 of Underland, A Deep Time Journey, is sort of a general introduction talking about how we as humans go into the ground, in some cases to hide things, sometimes to preserve things, or even in some cases to learn about things, and that descending into the earth is a journey into the past. Archaeology being a major example there. You got to dig down into the earth to uncover history. And it can teach us about the past, the present, and the future. So we have an introduction here to the idea of deep time, which in other words is geological time, or kind of the history of the planet itself, the type of time spans that make a human life look that fleeting. We're here and gone. And that's one reason why I really enjoy reading about science and learning about science, because it really helps put my tiny little life into some kind of perspective and helps pull me away from all the ridiculous little stuff that annoys me day to day and puts a greater perspective on everything. It's the type of time, in fact, that makes stone almost feel like a liquid as opposed to a nice solid mass, because over the course of deep time, you have continents moving, coming together, forming up mountain ranges, rivers carving out canyons, and this whole kind of idea that stone is so fluid and moving and ever-changing and liquid. And that's kind of the concept of deep time. And in this discussion of deep time, in fact, we talk about the categorizations of geological time, which I had to educate myself on. I had no idea, for instance, that the categorization of geological time has so many subcategories within it. So, for instance, the broadest category of geological time starts with eons, and the current eon that we are in right now is called the Phanerozoic. Eons are then subdivided into eras, of which we are currently in the Cenozoic. Eras are then divided into periods, which the famous Jurassic period as an example, but at the moment we are in the Quaternary period. Periods are then divided into epochs, and we're officially in the Holocene period, but I'm going to talk about that in a second because unofficially we're in the Anthropocene period. And then finally, these epochs are further subdivided into ages, which at the moment we are in the Megalian age, which started about 4,200 years ago, or 2250 BCE, and it marks the increasing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere of the Industrial Revolution in particular. So I mentioned there that we might be in the process of moving from the Holocene epoch into the Anthropocene epoch, and this is something that has been proposed by an organization with the absolutely craziest name called the Anthropocene Working Group of the Subcommission on Quaternary Stratigraphers. That's a mouthful, but they have stated that we are currently in the Anthropocene, which they say started in about 1950 with the dawn of the nuclear age. That's kind of when we left the Holocene and began this new epoch. And this epoch is a time of ongoing crisis, as stated in the book here. We are presently living through the Anthropocene, an epoch of immense and often frightening change at a planetary scale, in which crisis exists not as an ever-deferred future apocalypse, but rather as an ongoing occurrence experienced most severely by the most vulnerable. Time is profoundly out of joint, and so is place. Things that should have stayed buried are rising up unbidden. When confronted by such surfacings, it can be hard to look away, seized by the obscenity of the intrusion. So that's why they have proposed that we have entered a new era, and the thought is that this Anthropocene epoch will end when the human species becomes extinct. As imagined by the author in this passage, lying there with bedrock in all directions, I wonder at what will remain of our cities as the Anthropocene unfolds over deep time, the stratigraphic markers that will endure in the rock record. Over millions of years, the inland megacities of Delhi and Moscow will largely erode into sands and gravels, to be spread by wind and water into unreadable expanses of desert. The coastal cities of New York and Amsterdam, those claimed soonest by the rising sea levels, will be packed more carefully into soft settling sediments. It is the invisible cities, the undercities, that will be preserved most cleanly, embedded as they already are within bedrock. The above-ground structures we have built will collapse to form jumbled urban strata, medleys of concrete, brick, and asphalt, glass compressed to a milky crystalline solid, steel dissolved to leave trace impressions of its presence. Below ground, though, the subways and the sewage systems, the catacombs and the quarry voids, these may preserve their integrity far into a post-human future. So after that introductory chapter, part one of the book is then divided into 3 chapters that all take place in various locations within England. In chapter 2, the author is in Somerset, England, where he talks about cave exploration and the preservation of memory through various burial practices. Here's one interesting point he brought up in that chapter. After mentioning a particular cemetery, he says, "We are often more tender to the dead than to the living, though it is the living who need our tenderness most." And it certainly had me reflecting on the practice of burial and tombstones and trying to maintain our memory and our legacy as long as possible after we die, which I think is such a silly effort, because our memories will live in the collective memory of various people for maybe 2 generations if we're lucky. Then after that, even if we have this nice solid stone headstone, graveyards get overrun and stones crumble away, and eventually we're all forgotten, unless we're a particularly notorious historical figure whose memory might last a couple thousand years at best. What we don't often think about is the fact that humanity as a species has an expiration date. For me, the idea that humanity will find a habitable planet, develop the technology to travel there and settle there and terraform the surrounding area in a way that will sustain human life if that all will happen before a mixture of climate change and human conflict wipes us out, it seems pretty impossible to me. So like all species, I think the human species will become extinct. And so our great efforts to maintain our memory and legacy after death are kind of a silly vanity that is kind of a human thing. And because of that, I also appreciate the author's father's approach here. My father's wish was that his ashes be scattered to the winds in 3 places, so that in this way there is no grave to which we will be tied after his death, and the medium of his remembrance will be in atmosphere, a skein of associations. Which I think is great. Personally, I'm giving my body to science. I will let the future medical students open me up and learn what they can learn from my body, and then, I don't know, whatever happens after that with it, I'm sure it'll be burned and the ashes done something with, hopefully planted under a tree or something like that, I don't know. But anyways, let's not dwell on death for too long here. Let's move on to the next chapter, which was in Yorkshire, England. And in this chapter, he is with physicists who are studying dark matter by trying to capture weakly interactive massive particles such as neutrinos half a mile below the surface of the Earth in abandoned salt mines. So he's going into these absolutely enormous salt mines in below Yorkshire, England, that literally stretch for miles into the Earth, even down under the... And these physicists have gone all the way under the Earth in an attempt to try to watch neutrinos flash through their neutrino detecting devices without a lot of other interference that would happen closer to the surface of the Earth. One of my favorite quotes in the book is from this chapter, but I'm going to save that to the end. In the next chapter, chapter 4, now we're in London, England, with a PhD biologist slash mycologist named Merlin Sheldrake. And I'm going to do, I think, the most quotes from this chapter because it talks about so much cool stuff. In particular, it focuses on the wood wide web in the earth below forests, which is where trees use these fungal networks below the forest in order to communicate with each other and actually help each other out. And there's so much interesting stuff happening when you start looking at fungi and lichen and the way trees use these fungal networks to communicate. So the first interesting point about that is when we think about evolution, we think about competition, the survival of the fittest, the strong destroying the weak in order to carry on. But it's interesting to see that there are areas of mutualism in nature. Mutualism is a subset of symbiosis in which there exists between organisms a prolonged relationship that is interdependent and reciprocally beneficial. And then he quotes this Merlin Sheldrake fellow who says, "What fascinates me about mutualisms," says Merlin, "is that one would predict from basic evolutionary theory that they would be massively unstable and collapse quickly into parasitism. But it turns out there are very ancient mutualisms which have remained stable for puzzlingly long times, between the yucca plant and yucca moths, for example, or, of course, between the bacteria that illuminate the bioluminescent headlamp of the bobtail squid and the squid itself." So it's fascinating to see nature working with other forms of nature to survive. Like I mentioned, this fungal network not only allows plants to communicate with each other, but check this out, even more remarkably, the network also allows plants to send immune signaling compounds to one another. A plant under attack from aphids can indicate to a nearby plant via the network that it should upregulate its defensive response before the aphids reach it. It has been known for some time that plants communicate above ground in comparable ways by means of diffusible hormones, but such airborne warnings are imprecise in their destinations. When the compounds travel by fungal networks, both the source and recipient can be specified. Our growing comprehension of the forest network asks profound questions about where species begin and end, about whether a forest might best be imagined as a superorganism, and about what trading, sharing, or even friendship might mean between plants and indeed between humans. I would also add the idea of intelligence and what the human idea of intelligence means and how that might be more broadly defined when you look at ecosystems and the organisms within them. Getting into what astonishing organisms these fungi and lichen are, Merlin says, Fungi and lichen annihilate our categories of gender. They reshape our ideas of community and cooperation. They screw up our hereditary model of evolutionary descent. They utterly liquidate our notions of time. Lichens can crumble rocks into dust with terrifying acids. Fungi can exude massively powerful enzymes outside their bodies that dissolve soil. They're the biggest organisms in the world and among the oldest. They're world makers and world breakers. Pretty cool stuff. And check out this stat as well. An eighth of the world's total biomass comprises bacteria that live below ground, and a further quarter is of fungal origin. And there's this one fungus in particular that he talks about. In the underland of the hardwood forests of Oregon's Blue Mountains, there exists a honey fungus, Armillaria solidipes, that is 2.5 miles in extent at its widest point and covers a total lateral area of almost 4 square miles. The blue whale is to this honey fungus as an ant is to us. It is a deeply mysterious organism, the largest in the world that we know of, and one of the oldest. The best guess that the U.S. Forest Service scientists have been able to offer for the honey fungus's age is between 2,000 and 9,000 years old. You thought all that was nuts? Here is something even more astonishing about fungi. Fungi were among the first organisms to return to the blast zone around the impact point in Hiroshima, the point from which the mushroom cloud had risen. After Hiroshima, too, images of the mushroom cloud began to appear ubiquitously in media and culture, the fruiting bodies of a new global anxiety. Scientists working in Chernobyl after the disaster there were surprised to discover fine threads of melanized fungi lacing the distressed concrete of their reactor itself, where radiation levels were over 500 times higher than in the normal environment. They were even more surprised to work out that the fungi were actively thriving due to the high levels of ionizing radiation, that they benefited from this usually lethal gale, increasing their biomass by processing it in some way. So the fungi are eating radiation, essentially. And the more you learn about fungi and bacteria, the more you realize that us humans who like to think that we're the smartest and we're running this planet, it's the bacteria and fungi that are really running this planet. And proof of that here is the fact that we are very much part fungi ourselves. Nature seems increasingly better understood in fungal terms, not as a single gleaming snow peak or tumbling river in which we might find redemption, nor as a diorama that we deplore or adore from a distance, but rather as an assemblage of entanglements of which we are messily part. We are coming to understand our bodies as habitats for hundreds of species, of which Homo sapiens is only one, our guts as jungles of bacterial flora, our skins as blooming fantastically with fungi. Yes, we are beginning to encounter ourselves, not always comfortably or pleasantly, as multi-species beings already partaking in timescales that are fabulously more complex than the onwards driving version of history many of us still imagine ourselves to inhabit. The work of the radical biologist Lynn Margulis and others has shown humans to be not solitary beings, but what Margulis memorably calls holobionts, collaborative compound organisms, ecological units consisting of trillions of bacteria, viruses, and fungi that coordinate the task of living together and sharing a common life, in the philosopher Glenn Albrecht's phrase. And then before I leave this chapter, I'm going to read a fairly lengthy quote because it's about language, and I have a bit of a fascination with language, so bear with me as I read a few paragraphs here that talk about an indigenous language in particular. In Potawatomi, not only humans, animals, and trees are alive, but so too are mountains, boulders, winds, and fire. Stories, songs, and rhythms are also animate. They are. They be. Potawatomi is a language abundant with verbs. 70% of its words are verbs, compared to 30% in English. Weikwegamea, for instance, means to be a bay. A bay is a noun only if water is dead, writes Kimmerer, quoting, trapped between its shores and contained by the word, but the verb releases the water from bondage and lets it live. To be a bay holds the wonder that for this moment the living water has decided to shelter itself between these shores, conversing with cedar roots and a flock of baby mergansers, unquote. Like Kimmerer, I wish for a language that recognizes and advances the animacy of the world, the life that pulses through pines and nuthatches and mushrooms welling up all around us. Like Kimmerer, I relish those aspects of discourse that extend being and sentience respectfully and flexibly beyond the usual bearers of such qualities. Like Kimmerer, I believe that we need now a grammar of animacy. A modern predisposition to regard animacy as anomaly runs through what the poet Jeremy Prine once called mammal language, by which he means the language that is used by humans, encoding intent, agency, and muscular power deep in its grammar. The real underland of language is not the roots of single words, but rather the soil of grammar and syntax, where habits of speech and therefore also habits of thought settle and interact over long periods of time, because the way we speak greatly influences the way we think and view things. Grammar and syntax exert powerful influence on the proceedings of language and its users. They shape the ways we relate to each other and to the living world. Words are world makers, and language is one of the great geological forces of the Anthropocene. Projects have recently been started around the world to gain even the most basic of vocabularies for the experiences of life and death in the Anthropocene. These stuttering attempts to speak what it is we are doing have generated ugly new terms for an ugly epoch: geotraumatics, planetary dysphoria, apex guilt. Such words feel like futile forms of nominalism, a hopelessly hyperactive pointing and naming. They stick in the throat in two ways. They are difficult to utter and hard to swallow. Only one of these recent coinages resonates with me: species loneliness, for the intense solitude that we are fashioning for ourselves as we strip the earth of the other life with which we share it. If there is human meaning to be made of the wood wide web, it is surely that what must save us as we move forwards into the precarious, unsettled centuries ahead is collaboration, mutualism, symbiosis, the inclusive human work of collective decision-making extended to more than human communities. Such cool stuff, but let's move on now. Part 2 of the book sees the author travel to Europe over the next 3 chapters, and in chapter 5 he starts in Paris, France, where he goes into the famous Paris catacombs and explores the catacombs and the communities that explore them and even at various times have inhabited them. And in the process he studies the relationship between urban development and the subterranean world. And just one quick quote from that chapter here that I found interesting. He talks about people that made that underworld their home, saying, "A commune culture emerged with its own honor codes. The rules were few and clear. Respect the past of the catacombs. Take out what you take in. Resources are to be shared even with strangers. No selling and no buying. Barter, exchange, or gift are the only acceptable modes of transaction. Help is to be given wherever necessary. Create with care and do not destroy." That's cool stuff. That's going back to old ways of living, back to our hunter-gatherer days when we lived as mutually supportive communities, the way the humans, I think, evolved to exist. But next in chapter 6, he goes to a place called the Carso in Italy, and he follows an underground river that in some places flows more than 1,000 vertical feet below the surface. One character he meets there has the coolest job. He's a guy known as Gregor the Grotto Keeper. It's his job to take care of the grotto that is one of the entrances to this river, I suppose. And in chapter 7, the final part of the Europe section of the book, he's in the Slovenian highlands, and there he is exploring sinkholes in limestone rock that were hiding places during World War II. And these hiding places were both hiding places from danger, from people who were trying to shoot you and bomb you. They were digging into the limestone mountains and creating caves and tunnel systems to escape from danger. But also they were to escape from the prying eyes of those who witnessed atrocities being committed, where certain populations were killed and dumped into these holes and hidden away from the eyes of the world, as it were. So there's one sinkhole in particular that the author goes to that was known for a particular atrocity where a whole bunch of people were massacred during the war and thrown into the hole. And there is a poem there describing the event and the memories it left. And the author describes the poem this way: "Imagine yourself as victim," the poem orders its readers. Think yourself into the skin of another human, for then, sunk into a different being, you will surely find yourself unable to inflict suffering. And that's the ultimate form of empathy, as the author then continues to go on to talk about. To the poem's author, the darkness of the bottomless pit represents the utter failure of empathy that characterized the war in those regions, as it must of necessity characterize war at all times and in all places. I think describing war in general as an utter failure of empathy is a great way to characterize it. The author mentions one person who survived the war and had spent years in German and Italian prisoners of war camps, and his mindset following those experiences. What did the mountaineer mystic W.H. Murray say after being released from years spent in German and Italian POW camps? Find beauty, be still. If that's not some of the best life advice I've ever heard, I don't know what is. Find beauty, be still. So part 3, the final part, was unfortunately where the book kind of lost me a bit. In this part, the author is in the far north over the course of 5 chapters, and in chapter 8 he's in a place called Lofoten in Norway, where he treks to an extremely cold, hostile, mountainous coastal location in order to check out some prehistoric cave paintings that are in these very difficult to access cave regions. However, in this chapter, he really takes a turn into very mystical type of thought and language, which I find so unfortunate, because I'm like, what the heck is with humans that we can't just sit and appreciate and admire the grandness and overwhelming beauty and wonder of nature without turning it into something mystical or spiritual, without just simply being and enjoying. But here's what I'm talking about. The author says, in the Celtic Christian tradition, thin places are those sites in a landscape where the borders between worlds or epochs feel at their most fragile. Such locations were, for the peregrini, or wandering devouts of circa AD 500 to 1000, often to be found on westerly headlands, islands, caves, coasts, and other brinks. This place now is one of the thinnest I have ever been. So I guess if you're in a cave facing west, you are in some kind of border between the mystical and the physical. And a bit later he carries on with, the scale of the entrance to the cave is astounding. A 150-foot high zone, the arc of the bay, the maw of the cave. This is an unmistakable performative space, a place for meaning making. The cave is a slip rift, an entrance to darkness where time shifts, pauses, folds, because it's a giant hole in the rock. And it just gets worse the more time the author spends in this cave here. And while it would be undoubtedly amazing to go view these cave art pieces that were made thousands of years ago by people living in a very different age, that would be pretty darn cool. But here's what the author says. These figures, referring to the paintings on the wall, are ghosts all dancing together, and I am a ghost too, and there is a conviviality to them, to us, to the thousands of years for which they have been dancing here together. Suddenly, unexpectedly, my head begins to tingle, and then my back and my chest start to shake, and I find myself crying, sobs shuddering my body in the teardrop-shaped rift, far from another human and so close to these generous figures. I mean, it's cool that he had such a profound experience there, but I'd love to know what the person who was scribbling human forms on a wall would think of somebody reacting to it in that way. I can imagine a modern graffiti spray painter watching somebody finding their little bit of art a few thousand years in the future and having a profoundly spiritual experience with it. The author's not the only one too. Here's how some other dude describes some other cave paintings. These animals live in an enormous present, which also contained past and future, a present in which nature was not only contiguous with them, but continuous. They flowed in and out of a continuum of everything around them, just as the animals flow into and out of the rock. And if the rock was alive, so were the animals. Everything was alive. Does that remind you of how art critics describe modern art? I mean, everybody gets something different out of art, to be fair. The author describes this hallucination he has. He says, "I look across the bay to the northern shore, and there, by the glimmering birches, is a figure standing dark on rising ground where no figure should be. The figure is in silhouette and does not move. It is human-like, and it is facing me. The figure watches me from the birches. Then 2 oyster catchers flicker across the water between us with high cries of alarm catching my eye, and when I look back across the bay, there is nothing on the rising ground, no one there at all." And then he concludes the chapter with, "For a long time after those days at the Cave of the Red Dancers, I find myself unable to shake the sense that I have left one of myselves back in the bay, left a figure on the shore." Bum, bum, bum. So, yeah, I'm like, why do you gotta make a great science book and then take it in that direction? And there's even one more example from the very next chapter where he meets this Norwegian guy and describes the Norwegian this way. "Bjornar's pupils are white-blue, so pale it seems he must be blind. They are the eyes of a seer, unsettlingly steady. He holds me still for a moment, looks me up and down, and I feel those eyes see into and through me." But maybe that's what makes him a great author, is that he can pull that kind of stuff out of regular interactions with rocks and pictures and people. Moving very quickly now through the final chapters. In chapter 9, he's in Andoya, Norway. Here the author goes out on a boat with a Norwegian fisherman who has dedicated decades of his life attempting to fight against the huge oil corporations that are attempting to blast the sea floor to bits in order to collect oil and essentially destroy the local environment. In chapter 10, he goes to Kulusuk, Greenland, and climbs to the top of a glacier called Apusiagic and talks to northern communities about how ever-warming temperatures and the ever-rapidly melting glacier are affecting their lives. He also talks about what can be revealed about the history of the world by drilling deep ice cores, hundreds of meters down into the ice, and pulling them out and seeing how the Earth changed over the course of deep time. In chapter 11, he's in Nudrasmussen Glacier, Greenland. He climbs an even bigger glacier there and then climbs deep down into the glacier via a hole called a mulin and gets to get really down far into the ice. In chapter 12, the final regular chapter, he's in Olkiluoto, Finland. And there he goes to a site that's being dug for the burial of radioactive waste. And just a couple quick quotes from that. "Deep in the bedrock of Olkiluoto Island in southwest Finland, a tomb is under construction. The tomb is intended to outlast not only the people who designed it, but also the species that designed it. It is intended to maintain its integrity without future maintenance for 100,000 years, able to endure a future ice age." Then he goes on to talk about just how long 100,000 years is. He talks more about the spent uranium and nuclear waste that's going to be buried there. And he says, "The time scale of the hazard is such that those responsible for entombing this waste must now face the question of how to communicate its danger to the distant future. This is a risk that will outlast not only the life of its makers, but perhaps also the species of its makers," as he said there. "How to mark this site? How to tell whatever beings will come to this desert place that what is kept in this rock sarcophagus is desperately harmful, is not of value, must never be disturbed." How do you tell the future alien race that finds it? No touchy. And then the final chapter, chapter 13, is the ending of the book. And it's just a brief image of the author spending time with his son as the next generation of humanity lives on in the world. And so we get this wonderful contrast from the first chapter talking about deep time, deep geological time, and the final chapter focusing on the intimate now with the generation that currently inhabits this planet. Before I finish with my very favorite parts here, I'll attempt to give a rating. It's always so difficult to rate nonfiction books because I guess I'm just purely basing my ratings on how much I enjoyed the book in general anyways, so maybe it shouldn't be that much harder, but Typically, I tend to rate nonfiction books very high because I'm less likely to accidentally read about something I'm uninterested in than if I'm picking up a fiction book that I don't know as much about. I would say this book maybe falls at about a 7 out of 10 for me. It could have been 8.5 out of 10 if it wasn't for all the weird mystical stuff the author got into. And if I didn't tire a little bit with the stylistic choices of the writing, I mean, I can't really knock that part too hard, because in reflection it makes it more interesting to read than your typical clinical science book. So I really probably should actually increase the rating rather than drop the rating for that in retrospect. But the main issues, like I said, were the kind of spiritual and mystical hallucinatory weirdness that was mixed in with the science and the history. But let's end with the really beautiful stuff that was in this book. The author takes the time to point out the amazing scientific work being done by so many people, so many of those that he interacted with over the course of his journeys and travels in this book were doing great scientific work for no reward other than the advancement of our knowledge. In one case, one of his guides to one of these Underland locations is a fellow named Sergio, and the author says, "How many times have you been down the abyss?" I ask Sergio. He shrugs, considers the question. "Maybe 400 times?" "Why?" The question puzzles Sergio. He thinks for a while. Lucien helps translate his answer. "For many years, there was nothing else to do. Also, for 80 years after its discovery in 1841, this was the deepest known cave in the world. Now we study it, come to know the river and its behavior. Our work here is not considered important by the authorities or by scientists, but still we go on. Here in the abyss we make romantic science." And then towards the end of the book, he also credits these people who are working towards goodness for the sake of humanity, which is something I think we need to hear in 2025. The author says, "I think of the many people I have encountered in and through the Underland who have been committed to shared human work rather than retreat and isolation." And that's where I feel shame about my own increasing self-isolation and withdrawal from humanity, but I'm thankful for those who are committed to this human mutualism and symbiosis. There's this one lady the author meets who I really appreciate her view on other people. And the author says she mistrusts formal qualifications, preferring to judge people on their capacity for empathy. And later, when he's going away and saying goodbye to her, she says to him, "Robert, you are a bellissimo animale." The author replies, "Maria Carmen, that is about the nicest thing anyone has ever called me," I say. "If I had business cards, I'd print that on them as my profession. Thank you from the bottom of my heart." As we drive north, gaining height on switchback roads, I ask Lucien if I was right to have heard her comment as a compliment. "Oh yes," he says, "the highest of compliments. Maria Carmen regards animals as far more impressive than humans. To her, heart and kindness are more important than any honorifics or degrees." That is absolutely the way that we ought to look and judge other people, is by their empathy, their heart, and their kindness, instead of the way we usually judge people, which is by their wealth, status, degrees, titles, online presence, views and popularity, all this ridiculous stuff that it means nothing to the human race and the world as a whole. I mean, certainly in my paramedic career, when I was doing CPR on somebody, they didn't look much different if they were a wealthy millionaire in a mansion or a poor person out in the street. Once I cut their clothes off them and was doing chest compressions, they all pretty much looked the same at that point. So yeah, I've never been one to be overly impressed by the outward status of people. It's certainly empathy, heart, and kindness are the way to look at it. Like I said, one reason why I love science is the perspective it gives. And like I said, viewing the world through this lens of deep time is one way to do so. But there's also a tendency to veer towards nihilism too with that outlook, and the author addresses that here. "There is dangerous comfort to be drawn from deep time. An ethical lotus eating beckons. What does our behavior matter when Homo sapiens will have disappeared from the earth in the blink of a geological eye? Viewed from the perspective of a desert or an ocean, human morality looks absurd, crushed to irrelevance. Assertions of value seem futile. A flat ontology entices. All life is equally insignificant in the face of eventual ruin. The extinction of a species or an ecosystem scarcely matters in the context of the planet's cycles of erosion and repair. We should resist such inertial thinking. Indeed, we should urge its opposite, deep time as a radical perspective, provoking us to action, not apathy. For to think in deep time can be a means not of escaping our troubled present, but rather of reimagining it, countermanding its quick greeds and furies with older, slower stories of making and unmaking. At its best, a deep time awareness might help to see ourselves as part of a web of gift, inheritance, and legacy stretching over millions of years past and millions to come, bringing us to consider what we are leaving behind for the epochs and beings that will follow us. When viewed in deep time, things come alive that seemed inert. New responsibilities declare themselves. A conviviality of being leaps to mind and eye. The world becomes eerily various and vibrant again. Ice breathes, rock has tides, mountains ebb and flow, stone pulses. We live on a restless earth. That's a good caution to me, who admittedly has a tendency towards the apathy of nihilism. What does it all matter? Our life is here and it's done. So it's a good caution for me, but I'm going to read my favorite quote to finally wrap it all up here. Thanks for sticking with me if you've actually stuck around this long, and if not, who cares? I'm sure you have better things to do. So here, Robert Macfarlane, the author, is chatting with one of the physicists who's deep within the salt mines, trying to capture these some trace of these neutrinos that are zipping through us and the world at all times. And Robert Macfarlane has an interesting conversation that ends up veering to the theological when he's talking to Christopher, this physicist, that concludes in the most wonderful way possible. So I'm going to read a handful of paragraphs here again. My sense, I say to Christopher, is that the search for dark matter has produced an elaborate, delicate edifice of presuppositions and a network of worship sites, also known as laboratories, all dedicated to the search for an invisible universal entity which refuses to reveal itself. It seems to resemble what we call religion rather more than what we call science. I grew up as a very serious Christian, Christopher says. As did I. Then I lost my faith almost entirely when I found physics. Now that faith has returned, but in a much changed form. It's true that we dark matter researchers have less proof than other scientists in terms of what we seek to discover and what we believe we know. As to God, well, if there were a divinity, then it would be utterly separate from both scientific inquiry and human longing. Again, mirrors my beliefs entirely that, yeah, there's probably almost certainly a bigger picture in the universe, but whatever that bigger picture is way too big for our tiny little human minds to comprehend. But going on with the quote here, Christopher pauses again. It is not that this thinking is hard for him, he has moved down these paths before, but that he is picking each word with care. No divinity in which I would wish to believe would declare itself by means of what we would recognize as evidence. He gestures at the data readout. If there is a God, we should not be able to find it. If I detected proof of a deity, I would distrust that deity on the grounds that a God should be smarter than that. Does it change the way the world feels, I ask him, knowing that 100 trillion neutrinos pass through your body every second, that countless such particles perforate our brains and hearts? Does it change the way you feel about matter, about what matters? Are you surprised we don't fall through each surface of our world at every step, push through it with every touch? Christopher nods. He thinks. His screensaver changes to the limestone towers at Guyane, seen near dusk, such that they are backlit in ways that are considered widely appealing on Instagram and other large-scale image-sharing platforms. At the weekends, Christopher says, when I'm out for a walk with my wife along the cliff tops near here on a sunny day, I know our bodies are wide meshed nets and that the cliffs we're walking on are nets too, and sometimes it seems, yes, as miraculous as if in our everyday world we suddenly found ourselves walking on water or air. And I wonder what it must be like sometimes not to know that. He pauses, and it is clear that he is thinking now beyond the confines of the salt cavern, beyond even the known limits of the universe. But mostly, and in several ways, I'm amazed I'm able to hold the hand of the person I love. And at the end of it all, isn't that what it's all about?